Okay, now we are. All right. So, um, the book of Job, we started off last week. We gave an introduction to the book, and then we got into Job chapter 1 and what it teaches us about the kind of person Job was. I mention this every time we get into the class just so that we're reminded. Job was a blameless and upright man, one who feared God and turned away from evil. That's Job 1 and verse 1. And then in Job 1 and verse 8, the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there's none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil? And so that's just a reminder of the kind of person that Job was, who he was, and the kind of character he had. So as we start making our way through the book of Job, no matter what else you encounter, just remember that that's God's estimation of Job. That's God's view of him as a person. And that's how we're to see him as a faithful servant of God. So Job 1, 6 through 12, there's the invitation to tempt and test Job, and the devil is roaming through to and fro throughout the earth. And God says, have you considered my servant Job? There's nobody like him in all the earth. And what does the devil say? What does the adversary say about why Job is willing to serve God? What does he say to God in verses 9 really down through 11?
He doesn't serve by by or he served him by gain or for gain.
Yeah. He says in verse 9, does Job serve God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You've blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he'll curse you to your face. So he's saying Job only serves for material prosperity, right? We've already read about Job's wealth in verse 3. And so the devil is tying Job's service to God to the material benefits that he believes that Job receives. Now let's pick up. Now we're ready to pick up in verse 13. And God says in verse 12, behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. So God basically says, let's put this theory to the test from Satan. Will Job continue to serve me no matter what happens? And God believes that he will. Satan believes take his material possessions, and he won't. But let's read Job 1:13 down through 19. Now there was a day when his sons, that's Job, his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And there came a messenger to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabians fell upon them and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. And I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the Chaldeans formed three groups and made a raid on the camels and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the four corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are dead, and I alone have escaped to tell you. Then Job arose. Well, we'll stop there in 19. So first things first, there's this, you could just title this section unimaginable loss, right? Because Job loses so much back to back. So, and it says that all of this happens kind of in a day. Now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. So the testing begins, and Job loses some very valuable things and some invaluable people. What all does Job lose in this first round of suffering? What does Job lose as you go through the text? Note some of the things. Tell me, what did Job lose this first time around?
The donkeys and the oxen.
All right, so he lost the donkeys and the oxen, and you could tie that back to verse 3. That's his material prosperities. He had 500 female donkeys. He had oxen, 500 yoke of oxen, 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels. But according to verse number 14, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys were feeding beside them, and the Sabians fell upon them and took them and struck down the servants. So this isn't all just like natural disaster or people just falling dead. The devil is using these foreign people to come in and take Job's property, possessions, and things. So it says Sabians, this foreign group, comes in and they fall on his material possessions and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. So even the great many servants, that verse 3 says Job had very many servants. The servants are killed by the Sabians as well. That's often not noted, but Job's servants have died. And throughout this ordeal, there's this statement that keeps coming up, and I alone have escaped to tell you. Basically, the servants that are bringing the word back to Job are saying, the only reason why I've been preserved is to bring you this bad news. And they're coming in these waves back to back. So the first thing is the Gracia says the donkeys and the oxen and the servants. All right, what else? What else is lost in this first round? After that is what?
The sheep and more servants.
The sheep and more servants. Job's having a bad day. It's getting worse. Yeah, the sheep and more servants. And the fire of God fell from them. So this is just a natural disaster. You've got foreign enemies coming in, and then there's just unfavorable circumstances. Fire comes down from heaven, strikes them in his material possessions. And how does verse 17 start?
While he was yet speaking.
So Job's receiving this bad news. He can't even process it all, right? So he's getting these waves of negativity and bad news. And while he's yet speaking, sometimes people use this phrase. I know they use it in other cultures, but especially in the United States, people will say, if it's not one thing, it's another. And that's a phrase normally meaning, it seems like when bad things happen, they just kind of come back to back. For Job, that wasn't a proverb or a figure of speech. It was a literal thing that was happening. He's getting bad news over here. And while this person's still speaking and still giving him the bad news, while he's yet speaking, your servants die. Another man rushes in and he doesn't have good news. Hey, this also was destroyed. Verse 17, though, says, another came in and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 groups. They made a raid on the camels, took them and struck them down, the servants with the edge of the sword. All of this is specific because the very things that we read about Job possessing in the first 5 verses that mark him as a blessed man, and that God gave Job for sure, but due to his faithfulness and godliness, are the very things that are stripped away from Job. And when the devil says, Job doesn't serve God for naught, you've set this hedge of protection around him and blessed him with all these material possessions, God allows the devil to specifically attack those things and those materials, and it's outlined for us so that we see everything that Job had, Job lost. Verse 18, while he was yet speaking, there came another. And this is this is the greatest loss that Job suffered. In verse 18, while he was yet speaking, there came another and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are dead. And I alone have escaped to tell you. So here we have what happens to Job's children.
Die?
They die. How?
Because the strong wind struck the house where they were
fasting. A strong wind, some tornado-like wind comes through and strikes their house. Let me check something and see how this phrase, a strong wind came upon the house where they were, upon the corners of their house. So this strong wind comes through and basically just destroys the house. All of his children die. Do you know anybody who ever suffered like Job? Like this? Gracia is saying, no, I think this is right. David, you're right. Sometimes people make these parallels, like their life, they suffer hardship. It's like Job. And yes, people suffer. And yes, Job suffered. And there can be some similarities. Nobody's ever had a day like this. All your property, all your servants, all your children, 10 funerals with one day. Nobody's ever suffered like Job. Not to this degree. And unless you want to lay Jesus Christ suffering as the Son of God for no reason at all next to this, nobody's ever suffered like Job in this regard. And so that matters because the things that Job's going to say later, the outlandish things Job's going to say about God and God setting him up for target practice and God hating him, or in Job 21, God letting the wicked get away with whatever they want. Job's mad, Job's frustrated. But the great depths to which Job has suffered is bringing this out of him. Job's reasoning the way that he is because he's hurting so terribly bad. Job is so frustrated about his circumstances that he's saying some things that may not make sense. But initially, Job seems to take his suffering well. Look at verses 20 down through verse 22. Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head, and he fell on the ground and worshiped. And Job said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And all of this, Job didn't sin or charge God with wrong. And so that's important. What did Job do initially when he responded? What was his initial response?
He worshipped to God.
Yes, Job.
You're much better. I
You're
I
in
can't hear
silence.
you. Is it just me that I don't hear?
No, it's not just you.
Me now?
Now we hear it.
Yeah,
All right,
yeah,
cool. Sorry. I was on this microphone. Let me try one more. Can't hear me. What about now?
Now, yes.
Yes,
now
you
it's
can hear me
good.
now. Sorry. All right, great. Sorry. What did Job say? That's what I was wondering. What did Job say? He fell down in worship, but what was his words? Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will return. The Lord gave, the Lord take away, but blessed be the name of the Lord. What does that mean? What was Job saying about his material possessions and about God? He fell down and worshiped on this day, fell on his face and bowed down and gave God worship. But this statement, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away, but blessed be the name of the Lord. Or naked I came out of my mother's womb, and naked will I return, right? What is Job saying about his faith in God and his relationship to the Lord?
I think he's trying to say that everything that he has, or everything that he has, is by the grace of the Lord.
And
And
when God takes it away, it was God's to begin with. This is a First Timothy 6 principle. Go to First Timothy 6. Notice First Timothy 6 and what Paul says about material possessions in this section. First Timothy 6, really, you can start in verse 6 and work your way down through about verse 18. First Timothy 6 and verse 6 says, godliness with contentment. First Timothy 6:6, godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world. But if we have food and clothing, with these we shall be content. He said, with these we shall be content. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge men into destruction. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. It's through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. And if you go to First Timothy 6 and verse 17, it says, as for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but instead on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous, ready to share, thus storing up treasures for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so they may take hold of that which is truly life. So Job views his material possessions as ultimately coming from God. But here's a mistake that we shouldn't make with Job's statements at the end of chapter 1. Job's just suffered terrible loss. Job's a man of great faith, and he's a great example as he says, the Lord gives, the Lord's taken away, but blessed be the name of the Lord. But that doesn't mean at all that this doesn't hurt Job or that it doesn't sting. Sometimes immediately in the face of loss and hardship, people respond with great faith. But then as things settle in, and I think that's what happens in chapter 3, as Job's hardship and suffering starts to settle in, and he's had some time to think through it. At first, people think, when they have a great loss, maybe there's a funeral and other things are happening and they're just kind of going with the flow. A person may think this is going to be okay, I can handle this. But when the day-to-day life and the normalcy happens, people can kind of go through a sense of shock. And I think as Job starts to embrace the loss, the kids aren't coming back, the property, the servants are gone. That's why he responds the way that he does. So you might be questioning, well, in the beginning, Job just says, the Lord gives, the Lord takes away, blessed be the name of the Lord. Why didn't he just keep that mindset throughout? Well, Job 1:20 through 22 is what Job believes about God, and it is the faith that he possesses. But as he has to wrestle with this and work through it later, just like you have to do, a lot of Bible passages, a lot of Bible verses. But when hardship comes into your life, it also can obscure your vision, and the things that you know and profess and believe can kind of shrink in size or become obscure or kind of blurry for you, and you might fail to see what you really believe in those moments. And I think that's some of what Job's going through. What is
Please, I have a question.
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, so my question is in two parts. The first is, will it be possible that Job was once like a poor person who God lifted to this degree that he had at the time that they were describing his work? So he's just appreciating that maybe he was just a nobody and now he's somebody. So if he is to go back to um, the the time that he had,
To
maybe
his
now.
humble beginning, his humble beginning.
Yes. So I was just thinking about that. And the second question is, um, the kind of relationship between Job and God is more intimate, that he knows that he is the one taking away and he's the one giving. So what about right now, our present age, that we know a whole lot of factors can come into our lives and it will take maybe some things from us, will bring or bring some things in our life. How would you able to know that this thing which is going on in my life is God who is doing that, or maybe your
Especially about suffering, right? About suffering.
yes.
I'm
How
gonna get
how
to the
can we be
suffering in
sure
a
about
minute.
that?
I'm gonna get to that in a minute, but let me answer the first question. The first question you asked me would make a good movie. Job, from rags to riches, right? Like if Job had nothing, then Job was wealthy, and then Job lost it again. Here's the facts. We don't know how Job's life was before. We're introduced to Job in Job 1, and we're just told about his wealth. Of course, everything that anybody has comes from God. So Job's prosperity came from God, whether he was poor at the beginning or not. But the book doesn't tell us that Job was poor or impoverished or a nobody and then God exalted him. In fact, when you get to Job 31, really 29 through 31, Job tells us some things about his life we wouldn't know otherwise. And one of the things he says in that section is, we've been taking care of poor people all our lives, and that God, we had strangers in our home. So it seems like Job came from a wealthy family, a sacrificial family that was blessed in some other ways. But the wealth that Job has at the beginning, his own personal wealth as an adult, is tied to his faithfulness to God, is tied to his relationship with God. That's where it's tied. The second question, I'll answer it in a minute, but let me give you first, and this is some things that I want you to know for the test, okay? These things here will show up later on the test. From Job 1:20 through 22, what are some of the things that Job teaches us that can help people survive the worst days of their life? How do we learn how to get through difficult times? I'm going to give you this, and then Christopher, I'm going to answer your question about how do we know when bad things happen. Job attributes this to the Lord, but how can we tell the difference between this is God's doing and why people suffer, or this is just life happening? Like, how can we be sure? Job definitely points his to the Lord, and we've read the first part of the book, so we know he's right. But in our day-to-day lives, how do we know the difference? I'll answer that in a minute. But first, this brief section on how to survive the worst day of your life from the book of Job, and what are some of the principles we learn right out of verses 20 through 22. I'm going to ask you this on a test, okay? I'll say, what are the lessons we learn from Job on how to survive the most difficult times of our lives? Here's number one. It's in Job 1 and verse 20. Job 1 and verse 20, and that is lament openly. Lament, Lament, lament openly. What is lament, David? Do you know what lament is? What is that?
Is don't hide. Well, in this case, openly is don't hide your feelings.
Yeah,
Don't.
that's right. Don't hide your feelings is probably, and y'all could word it that way. That's easier, David. You did better than me. That's right. Don't say lament. Just use a $2. Don't use a $10 word when you can use a $2 word. Yeah, that's right. I like that. So don't hide your feelings. But what kind of feeling is lament, Gracia? What kind of feeling? Don't hide your feelings is right, but what kind of
Um,
feeling is lament?
I think it's more of like
Hold on, hold on, hold on,
sorrowful.
hold on, hold on. Let me see. Let me let Gracia do it. She's like, he's helping
Okay.
me. Rescue me, Christopher. Rescue me, Christopher.
Yeah,
What is
yeah.
lament?
Working answer. I don't know actually what kind of.
What is lament? What does that mean? Do you know?
No.
All right, Christopher, you can help now. Go ahead.
I think it's more of like a sorrowful mood, like crying or being down.
Yeah, that's right. Crying and being down. What does Job do? Job 1 and verse number 20, it says, oh, and Job arose and tore his clothes. And Job 1 and verse 20, he tore his clothes, he cut off the hair on his head, and he fell to the earth and he worshiped. So all of that in Hebrew is about lament. It's like he tore his clothes. That's a sign of grief. He cut off his hair, put dust on his head. He's covered in sackcloth and ashes. And he's saying, this is a bad day. I'm mourning, right? People used to wear black to funerals all the time. It was a sign of mourning and sorrow. The Bible has a whole genre, a whole style of literature known as laments. It's in the Psalms. There's a whole book in the Bible after Jeremiah called Lament what? Lamentations. We don't study Lamentations a lot, but it's 5 chapters. It's an acrostic poem, basically from A to Z in Hebrew. Every chapter works that way. And Jeremiah is weeping from A to Z about the captivity of God's people from Jerusalem to Babylon because of their idolatry. But he's pouring out his heart in lament. What's said about Jesus in Isaiah 53? How is he described? He's described as a man of sorrow and what else? Y'all know the rest? A man of sorrow and acquainted with grief. Jesus was a man known for being acquainted with sorrow, and he was a man of sorrow and acquainted with grief. Did Jesus ever do any crying in his life, Sergio? And if so, when?
Say you again, brother. Sorry. Crime?
Yes. Did Jesus ever cry in his life, and when?
When his friend Lazarus died.
Now, let me ask you a question. This is where it gets tricky, Sergio. This is where it gets tricky for me. Okay, you're going to help me. Jesus cried at Lazarus' tomb. True or false? True. That's right. John 11:35, Jesus wept, everybody,
True,
right?
yeah.
Y'all know that one. Now, here's my question. Why did Jesus go to Lazarus' grave, Sergio? Why did he go there anyway? Why did he go to Bethany?
I don't understand well, brother. the
What
question.
what did Jesus go to Lazarus' grave to do? What was Jesus going to do? Lazarus was dead, and Jesus went there to do what?
In the cross.
Yeah, but he went to Lazarus' tomb to raise Lazarus what?
Yeah, out of the grave.
Yeah, he went to raise Lazarus from the dead, right? That's why Jesus went to Lazarus' tomb. So why was he crying if he knew he was going to raise him from the dead, David? If he knew he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead, why would you be crying at somebody's funeral that you know is about to get up?
It's part of, I believe, it's part of his humanity,
You're a human being.
and he is looking all the people suffering for their relative, and so he has compassion.
That's right. He's still a human being. And to see all of these people heartbroken, even though you know it's going to end well, still there's sorrow, there's hurt, there's hardship. So it's just a reminder we need to lament. Sometimes we don't want to cry, we want to hold it in, but it's biblical to let it out. You need to express it. So Jesus cried, John 11:35, at the tomb of Lazarus. Jesus also wept over the city of Jerusalem. Luke 19:41 says he wept over Jerusalem. And he was frustrated because the people wouldn't receive him as God's messianic prophet. And so in Luke 19:41, he burst into tears over the city. That's the second. And then Hebrews chapter 5 and verse 7 mentions a third time Jesus offered up strong prayers and tears to the one who was able to save him, and he was heard because of his godly reverence. And though he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the author of eternal salvation to all them that obey him. So Jesus cried at a funeral, Jesus cried over the city, and Jesus cried at Hebrews 5:7 is most likely a reference to Gethsemane. And right before the cross, Jesus wept because of what was about to take place and what it was going to take to save us. If Jesus, the perfect human, showed his emotions and was willing to weep and be open about difficulty, we need to be the same way. Amen. Like that's one of the lessons from Job is to lament openly. Sometimes anybody ever seen somebody suffering and people come on, they say, don't cry, be strong. It's not strong not to cry. It's no be strong. It's be human. See, Job lamented openly. That's one of the things that helped him. Holding it in doesn't help. It's got to come out either way. And it may come out in anger or frustration if you don't deal with it properly. So that's the first thing. Here's number 2. In days of difficulty, worship God. Number 2 to write down is to worship God. What does Job do in his hardship? He laments and he also worships God. Look at verse 21 or the end of verse 20. He fell on the ground and he worshiped and he said, naked I came from my mother's womb and naked I will return. The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away, but blessed be the name of the Lord. The second thing Job does is he still worships. because worship reminds you of how great God is and how small we are. And it helps you keep things in perspective. Sometimes when people are going through difficulty, the first thing they think is, I'm not going to go to worship. I'm not going to go to church. I'm hurting right now. Bad things are going on in my life. I'm going to stay home. And the devil wants to keep you separated from God. But going to worship helps to situate things in life and make them right. It reminds you of the greatness of God, even in the midst of hardship and difficulty. So, in hardships and difficult times, on the worst days of your life, like Job, go to worship and worship God. Look at another example of this. Go to Psalm 73. Psalm 73. Psalm 73 is about a man named Asaph who's struggling in his faith, and he thinks that the wicked people get away with everything and God doesn't do anything about it. And so in Psalm 73, Asaph is saying, God just lets wicked people do whatever they want. God's not running the world properly. He's upset. But then when you get to Psalm 73, somebody read for me verse 16 and verse 17. Psalm 73, 16 and 17. Anybody can read that. Psalm 73, 16 and 17. Chris, go ahead. Read that for us.
Okay. It says, when I tried to understand all this, it was troublesome in my sight. Until I entered God's sanctuary, then I discerned their end.
So he says, I'm trying to figure out how wicked people get away with everything. I'm frustrated. But then when I went into the sanctuary of God, which is the Old Testament temple, the inner part where you would worship God, when Asaph went to worship, things started to make sense for him. And when you worship God, even in your confusion and difficulty, that helps life to make sense for you. Go worship God. Here's number 3. Job teaches us this: accept life's reality. Accept life's reality. So, first, Job lamented openly. Secondly, Job worshiped God. Thirdly, accept life's reality. What's life's reality? What does Job say about his stuff? The Lord gives and the Lord does what?
Takes away.
Yes. What else does he say at the beginning of verse 21? Naked I what? Naked I came out of my mother's womb, and what?
And naked shall I
Then
return.
I will go.
Which means what, Gracia?
It's because everything he has is because it belongs to God.
Yeah. How much of your stuff in this life are you taking with you to heaven?
Nothing.
Nothing.
God's not going to let you pack a bag. Nothing. Zero. Everybody. Nothing. See, Job understood that reality. And if you understand that reality, you know this. Here's a principle: everything we have, it's only a matter of time before we lose it. Everything you have is just a matter of time. Now, for Job, it was all in one day, but for all of us, it'll happen eventually. Everything you have, it's only a matter of time before you lose it. Physical things. And so Job was able to say, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked will I return. He realized that he was just a steward over what God had given him. 1 Corinthians 4, 1 and 2 says it's required of stewards that a man be found faithful. A steward is just a manager. The stuff belongs to somebody else, but you get to babysit it. You get to watch over it. And that's how God takes care of everything in the world. He lets us watch over it, but it ultimately belongs to him. It's his world, it's his stuff. And as a result of that, we worship and serve him. Here's number 4. Here's number 4. Acknowledge that God is sovereign. Acknowledge that God is sovereign. All right. David, what does sovereign mean? What does it mean that God is sovereign? You spell sovereign Sovereign. Sovereign. What does it mean that God is sovereign?
Then nobody has the right to tell him what to do.
He's in complete control. God does his own thing. God doesn't take orders from anybody. God runs the world. In this passage, how does Job show that he knows God's sovereign, that God's in complete control? What does he say in verse 21 that shows he believes God's in control of the whole world? What does he say? Somebody tell me. What does Job say that shows you he knows God is sovereign and in control of the whole world?
He's the one that gave, and he's the one that take away.
The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. You got to know both of those. You got to know both. Who gives? God gives everything. James 1:17. Every good and every perfect gift comes down from above, from the Father of lights, with who there is no variation or shadow due to change. God gives everything. but God also takes away. God has the power to take away. Now, Chris, we're going to get to your question about how do we know when is it God and when is it other things when we suffer and things happen in our lives, but God is the one in complete control. Hebrews 1 and verse 3 says, through Jesus, he upholds all things by the word of his power. And Colossians 1:17 talks about the world and Jesus as the God of over this world, God the Son, the image of God. And it says, in him all things consist or hold together. So nothing happens without God's approval or God knowing about it. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Job knew that, and that made a difference. And number 5, count your blessings. That's what Job does here, right? Things were going to get worse for Job. Job knew that things were going to get, well, he didn't know that things were going to get worse in chapter 2, but they would. But for the time being, he knew God had given and God had taken away. But blessed be the name of the Lord. That's Job still seeing the good in everything. Job says, but blessed be the name of the Lord. He's still seeing whatever good remains and resolving to be positive about what he did have remaining. And here's the last thing. I gave you 6 on the test. I'll say, what are the 6 things we learn from Job about how to make it through, right? Here's number 6. Don't blame God when bad things happen. Read verse 22 for me, David. Job 1 and verse 22.
In all these Job sinned not charge God foolishly.
All right. And you could put in the side for now, right? Because Job's about to get foolish in a minute. He's revving up, man. Job is warming up. He's going to get foolish. But initially, Job didn't sin and he never charged God foolishly, which means Job never said, God, this is all your fault. Look at James chapter 1. Hold your hand in Job. Go to James chapter 1. James 1 and notice verse 13 down through verse 15. James 1:13 through 15. This is about temptation, but it also is about the character of God. And so it's important. James
Okay,
1,
you read.
James 1
It
and verse
says,
13 says, let no
this
one say when he's tempted. Your mic is open, Chris. What's up?
when tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for
Mm-hmm.
God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each one is tempted by his own evil desire when he is lured away and enticed. And after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, gives birth to death.
So there you go. James says, don't ever, and then verse 16, don't be deceived, my beloved brothers, right? That's verse 16. The idea is don't ever blame God because you're suffering or being tempted. Don't say this is God's fault or God did this to me, because God gives every good and perfect gift, is what he's going to say in verse 17. Verse 22 of Job 1, and all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. Job was careful not to point the finger at God, at least at the beginning, and say, this is your fault. Now, here's the thing about this. Part of what made this possible for Job in the beginning was his faith, right? He trusted and believed in God. But here's another thing about Job's life that you got to take into account too. When it first happens, Job also has some things to point to that would kind of show him this isn't God's fault, like the Sabian army and these pagan people that came in and killed his servants and stuff. So he can point to that and say, that's not God's fault that these armies and these different groups of people came in. Oh, the windstorm came and killed my children. That's not God's fault. The Chaldeans, the Babylonians came in and they destroyed the camels and took some more of the servants away with the sword. So Job was able to look at all those things and he never blamed God. And it's important for us not to do that too. Sometimes in our lives, we want to take the credit for the good and blame the bad on God, but it's actually the other way around. God deserves all the praise, the glory, the honor, and the credit for the good things. And most times the terrible things that happen in our lives come into our lives because of us or potentially other people. So now let's talk a little bit about Christopher had asked me, well, Job, he committed everything in his life to God, and he knew that he was suffering because of, um, he was suffering, at least initially, because God gives, God takes away. But how can we know when things are taken away from us or when terrible things happen in life, when we suffer in general? How can we know why the bad things are happening, right, Christopher? That was your question. Like, how can we know in suffering whether it's God or whether it's just chance or things are just happening? How can we say specifically, okay, here's God, here's how this happening? Okay, let me give you some of the responses or what the Bible teaches about suffering and the way it happens. This is also for a test. Okay, I want you to know this for the test. So when I say that, this is something you need to write down so you'll know it if you're taking notes, but you need to write this down later. So there are different types of suffering in the world, and the Bible gives different reasons why people suffer. And then I'll kind of give you a summary on how this works. But number one, first, sometimes we suffer because of our sins, right? That's what James 1 says. Every man is tempted in James 1:14 when he's lured away of his own lust and he's enticed. Sometimes people suffer because they made bad choices. That's not God's fault. Sometimes it's our fault. Look at Proverbs 13. Proverbs 13 and verse 15. I like the way the old King James says this, but this is the ESV. Proverbs 13:15 says, good sense wins favor, but the way of the treacherous is their ruin, right? So good sense wins favor, Proverbs 13:15, but the way of the treacherous is their ruin. The old King James says, the way of the transgressor is hard, meaning if you make bad choices, you're going to have bad consequences. So sometimes suffering enters a person's life, and when you're suffering, you can say, or somebody else is suffering, I wonder if this is because I sinned or I violated God's will or I've done something that I shouldn't have done. That's number one. But that's not always the reason. There are other reasons why people suffer. Number two, sometimes people suffer because of the sins of others. Sometimes other people do terrible things and it causes difficult times and circumstances for you. So sometimes it's your own personal sin. Other times it's other people's sin. Let me show you a passage. Go to 2 Timothy 3. 2 Timothy 3. And the first person that gets there, 2 Timothy 3:12 and 13. 2 Timothy 3:12 and 13. Somebody read that for us, please.
Yeah, and all that will live godly in Christ Jesus shall
Mm-hmm.
suffer persecution, but evil men and seducers shall wax worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived.
So see, Paul says everybody that lives a godly life is going to suffer persecution. If you live a godly life in Christ Jesus, because of evil people, they're going to get worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived. So sometimes people suffer, according to this verse, because of other people's choices and other people's sin. Wicked and evil men bring bad things into the world. And in this case, specifically toward Christians, sometimes suffering is because of our sins. Sometimes it's because of the sins of others. Here's number three. Sometimes we suffer just because we're in the world. We're in the world. And because the world is filled with sin and shortcomings, sometimes it's because you're living in a fallen world. After Adam and Eve sinned in Genesis 3, they're kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And as they're kicked out of the Garden of Eden, this world has good, this world has bad, this world has suffering, this world has death, this world has sickness, this world has heartbreak. And just because you live here, sometimes it doesn't make any sense, excuse me, but people still suffer. Passage for that, go to John 16. Go to John 16. Now, we looked at this last time, but we'll read it again with the focus on why difficulties come into the world. Go to John 16 and read verse 33. John 16:33. Or I'll read it. I'll read verse 33. John 16 and verse 33. And it says, I have said these things to you that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world. And so in the world you'll have tribulation. The Bible talks about three worlds. I like to make this point so that people know it. The Bible talks about three worlds. You need to know these three. The first world is Adam and Eve. That's in the Garden of Eden. That's the perfect world. What happened to that world? We lost that world because of their sin. That world's not coming back. That's world number one. World number two is this world. Are there good things in this world? Some good, some bad. It's a mixed bag, right? It's some good and bad. And then world number three is heaven with God forever and ever in the new world, new heavens and new earth. 2 Peter 3:13, our heavenly inheritance. So there are three worlds. Adam and Eve's world, we're never going there. We're never going back to the Garden of Eden. That's done. World number two, where you live, and world number three to come. Are you in world number three yet? So don't think about this world like world number 3. Sometimes people get their worlds mixed up and they think, why is bad things happening? Well, when you get to world number 3, if bad things happen, you can say, hey, what's going on here? It's not supposed to be like that. But here, bad things do happen. There is miscarriages of justice. There are people that are mistreated. There are disappointments. Sometimes suffering happens just because you're in world number what? 2. This is world number 2. Don't forget. All right. And here's another one. Sometimes you suffer because you're a Christian. So sometimes it's other people's sin. Sometimes it's your sin. Sometimes it's because you're in world number 2. And sometimes it's because you suffer as a Christian. Christopher, read 1 Peter 4:16. 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 16. First Peter 4:16.
Okay, Aries. But if you suffer as a Christian, do not be ashamed, but glorify God that you bear that name.
All right. So sometimes people suffer as a Christian. And Peter says specifically, if anybody suffers as a Christian, don't be ashamed, but glorify God in this behalf, right? So be happy to suffer for Jesus' sake and glorify God in this name. So one of the reasons people sometimes suffer is as a Christian. And here's the last one. Here's the last one on this list. Sometimes suffering enters into our world in our life because God is testing us. God doesn't tempt us, but God will test us. He does it with Abraham in Genesis 22 and verse 1. But Romans 5 also says that God uses difficulty to develop us and to mature us. Romans 5, listen to verses 2 through 5. Romans 5, starting in verse 2, through him, that's through Jesus, we have obtained access by faith into this grace in which we stand, and we rejoice in the hope of the glory of God. Not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that our suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and that hope does not put us to shame because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. And so sometimes suffering comes and it's used by God as an opportunity to develop and to grow. And you could write right next to this James 1, 2 through 4, and James 1 and verse 12, which says, count it all joy when you fall into trials of various temptations, knowing that the trying or the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and that steadfastness, completion or perfection, and let it have its perfect work, that you might be perfect and entire, lacking in nothing. Or James 1 and verse 12, blessed is the man who endures temptation. When he's tried, he'll receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. So sometimes suffering comes into our life because of God using it as a test. So I gave you a bunch of reasons why people suffer, but I didn't answer Chris's question just yet. How do we know which is which? And here's my response. The only one you can know for sure in the list is your own number one, your own sin. Sometimes we suffer because of our own sin. Or if somebody else is causing you to suffer because of their sin, you could know that. But the others in this list, like living in world number 2, suffering as a Christian, suffering as a test from God, you can always determine. Even Job never got the answers to know. But here's the thing. God can bring about good through any one of these, even when it is because of our sin or somebody else's, because we can repent and be restored, and God can override the wickedness and the evil that other people have planned against us. So the wise thing to do is not to waste a lot of time trying to figure out which one of these it is on the list. Instead, it's flee sin and ungodliness so you don't intensify your suffering and make it worse. Don't try to figure it out. Just make up your mind to be faithful to God in the midst of the suffering, no matter what happens. Does that make sense? Instead of trying to figure out, I wonder if this is from God or if it doesn't matter. If it's because somebody in the world's persecuting you or causing trouble, God can use it for good and refine you, and you can come out on the other side. You can pray for them, and God can work on their hearts and stop them from doing evil. If it's just because we're in world number 2 and bad things happen here, Jesus says, be of good cheer. I've overcome the world, John 16:33. So pinpointing the reason for suffering and saying, I've got to know exactly why, isn't the most important thing. The most important thing is God's in complete control. And because he is, it doesn't really matter what comes in our lives. Like Job realized, God's sovereign. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away, but blessed be the name of the Lord. That's ultimately what counts and will see you through. All right. Any questions on that so far? Any questions on Job chapter 1, or any comments on what happens with Job in this suffering?
Brother.
Okay. Okay, I'm after you. Brother David.
Hmm. Go
I
ahead,
said, Brother
Chris.
David. Okay. At first, when I was growing up, like when I was a young boy, I always pray that if God is to teach me a lesson, or He should give me a wisdom, He should put, put it through a test.
Hmm.
But later, when I realized, at times when these things comes, I was like, God, I prayed for this, but not as severe as I am going through.
Yeah, that's right. So the thing is, you can pray for tests, but you can't pray for the severity, right? That's up to God. But also, God doesn't necessarily have to work through the means that we want him to either. So you might have prayed for God to teach you a lesson, and maybe God did use a test, but again, you can't say for sure if this was specifically from God and God was doing this to test you, or if it was just the happenstance of the world that it just happened that way, but God still was using it for sure. Yeah, but
Ye-
sometimes we don't like the severity, right? We don't. We say, I want patience, I want to grow, but I don't want it that way. And sometimes we don't
Yes,
like what God uses.
I remember my giving when, like giving that we giving as offering in church.
Mm-hmm.
When I was young, it was quite low, and I didn't really understand the essence of giving. Then I realized that I got sick some point in time, and I could use my money like always the time to buy drugs and all these things. I was like, ah, so it means I can give the money, but it depends on the mindset. So it was not that I cannot give, but it's because of I think, oh, um, if I give it to God, eventually He will give me back. So I was not really concerned about how much I would give.
Mm-hmm.
But when the sickness and these things came, I realized that Christopher can really give this sum of money. So the mindset was, uh, I don't want to give, I don't have money. But when the sickness and the disease came and I was giving money, I was going to buy the drugs. It was the price was it was very high. I was like, it means I have money. And even if I spend, I can go and ask my parents for the money. And later
That's right.
I understood that when these um, I put it as a test. When these tests came into my life, I realized that oh, I can actually give, and God will give back to me. So yeah, I kind of understand it from that point.
Yes, circumstances teach us lessons and help us to develop and grow. And I think that's what you're talking about. Like over time, you learn from the circumstances about trusting God in your giving and being faithful to Him, and life will teach you lessons. And God will use those things as a test to help us develop and strengthen us. Yes, David, go ahead.
I was wondering about the. So we know that this come from the devil, right? All the things that happened to Job.
Ah,
At
that
least,
gets tricky. I thought somebody was going to ask me that. That's a tricky question to answer, and you're going to see it directly in chapter 2 based on something God says. But go ahead.
mhm. Because I was seeing how the devil used the Sabaeans and the Chaldeans and the fire of God falling from heaven and the wind. So I was thinking, well, it is does the devil has this power to use those things?
Yeah, we're gonna get into chapter 2, and it's gonna answer that question. A lot of
Okay.
people have that question: who's doing this? Well, Christopher mentioned earlier that Job believed everything came from God, and Job says that the Lord gives and the Lord what takes away, but blessed be the name of Yahweh. That's what he says. So now let's read in chapter 2, and we're gonna read the first 6 verses. And I want to ask you something, David. We'll see. Okay, Job 2 1 through 6. You ready? Let's go. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. And Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, from where have you come? Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro on the earth and from walking up and down on it. And the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there's none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil? He still holds fast his integrity, though you incited me against him to destroy him without reason. And then Satan answered the Lord and said, skin for skin, all that a man has, he'll give for his life. but stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. And the Lord said to Satan, behold, he is in your hand, only spare his life. All right, so Job passes the first test, and there's a day when the sons of God come and present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The adversary was in that group, and the same thing happens. God says, where you been? And he says, I've been going up and down throughout the earth. And what does God say in verse 3, David? Your mic, I can't hear you.
The last part of verse 3 was interesting to me, where it says,
Yes, that's what I wanted you to
thou
read.
movest me against him to
That's right.
destroy him without cause.
So who does God say is doing all this?
He, God,
God said, you incited me against my servant Job. So here's how it works. Here's how you can make sense of it. The devil instigated this with Job. He told God Job was only serving him for profit, right? For money and for his possessions. But the devil doesn't have the power to move nations and move people and do that. Only God has that power. And God allowed it to happen in his what we'll call God's circumstantial will. So God has these three levels to his will. There's God's ideal will. God wants everybody to do the right thing all the time. That's what God wants, but people don't do that. There's God's circumstantial will, where God in this world and world number two permits people to use their free will to do sinful things, to do whatever they choose. And then there's God's ultimate will. That's in heaven and in hell. Nobody's going to break or change that. God's ultimate will. But in this level, level number two, the circumstantial will of God, God does allow these nations and these natural disasters even to come into Job's life and to do these things. So the devil is responsible for it in a way, but the devil can't just say, I'm going to cause this nation to go over here and go to war with this nation. Psalm 62:11 says, once has it been spoken, twice have I heard this. Power belongs to God. Romans 13:1-4, the nations are God's servants, especially Romans 13 and verse 4. And in Daniel 2 and throughout the book of Daniel, it says, God, Daniel 4:25, God rules in the kingdoms of men and gives it to whoever he wills. So this is God's world, and God may allow the devil to do something, or God may, to prove something to the devil or to put him in his place or teach him a lesson, like in the book of Job, he may allow some things to take place or even do some things on his own because he knew Job wasn't going to break. But the devil doesn't have the power to do these things. God does. And that's what he says at the end of verse 3. In fact, it's challenging because he says, you caused me to destroy him for no reason. Job did nothing wrong. Job didn't deserve this. It just came into his life as a test because of what's going on with what the devil's saying. So after that, when the devil realizes, okay, Job's still been faithful, what does he say now? What does he think is going to happen now? First, he said Job was serving God because of his material possessions, but what does he think it's all about now? What's his next test for Job? In verse 4, chapter 2, verse 4, what's his next test?
health, physical
Skin
health.
for skin for skin. All that a man has, he'll get for his life. If we can't hurt your property, we'll hurt your body. Physical. Anybody ever quit God that you know because physical? Somebody died or they got sick or something physical happened, and then now, I don't know, God's not helping me. God didn't answer my prayer. See, the devil thought material possessions would get Job. It didn't. Then he thought, well, maybe skin for skin, attack his health, and maybe that'll get Job. Was he right about Job? No, Job held fast. Job was faithful no matter what. Now, here is something to keep in mind about the devil that a lot of people don't really get right about Satan. Does the devil know everything? No. How do you
No,
know the devil doesn't know everything?
if
because
if he
Because he
knows,
killed Jesus.
Let me be specific. He's not God, yes, but how do you know from the book of Job that that David doesn't know everything?
Who needs to respond?
Anybody. How do you know from the book of Job that the devil doesn't know everything from these two chapters?
because
I
we can see in the beginning that devil thought Job is gonna start to worship God because he gonna took the position, but he was like trying because he cannot read the Job.
That's right. That's right, Grace. So he's just trying different things. Well, maybe possessions. Nope, that didn't work. Well, maybe physical. And we'll see later that doesn't work. The devil doesn't know everything. The devil just tries different things and sees what works on people. Some people think, oh, the devil knows our weaknesses. The devil's tempting us and he knows this. Nope, the devil knows what we show him. He knows what we say that we like. He knows what temptations we go after. But the devil's like Amazon, you know. On Amazon, if you buy something, then next they see what you like. They say, hey, you might like this. Amazon can't read your mind. They just see what you keep putting in your cart and they say, hey, you like this kind of food. You like these kind of books. I'll suggest more of this to you. They can't read your mind. They just can see what you go after. And then they just give you more options like that. The devil's just guessing with Job, and he thinks skin for skin, all that a man has, he'll give for his life. And the reason why he thinks that is because our physical lives mean so much to us. Our physical lives are important, and they they sometimes cause us to cripple and go through hardship. And so that's what he thinks. Verse 7, Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with loathsome sores. So God does allow him to do this. Struck Job with loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took a piece of broken pottery with which to scrape himself, and he sat in the ashes. So Job is covered from head to toe in these ashes and with these boils. We don't know what kind of skin disease this was. Leviticus 13 and 14 gives a long list of different kind of skin diseases that ancient Israelites could have. We sometimes call those all of them as leprosy, but there were varying skin conditions in the ancient Near East that a person could have, and some of them were more severe than others. But Job, his life's not over, but he is covered from head to foot in these in this sort of these loathsome sores. The ESV says these loathsome sores, and Job is sitting on the ashes, and Job's just scraping his skin. Job's in a rough spot. Now we get introduced to another character. Remember, I told you in the book of Job, when these characters come in, you should be interested in what are they going to say? What are they going to do? What's their role? Look at what happens next. Job 2, 9 and 10. Then his wife said to him, do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die. But Job said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? And all this, Job did not sin with his lips. So we know Job had children. Job was married. We don't know anything about his wife up until now. Job suffered all these losses. She's also suffered all of these losses. And now she shows up on the scene. And what is she telling Job to do? What is she saying to Job?
Oh, she was like, "Do you still hold fast your integrity?" So I'm trying to reason with her. Do you still believe that God is still with you?
Basically, she's saying, yeah, do you still think that this God thing is working for you? Curse God and die. She's saying, just give up already. Like Job, this whole the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Why would Job's wife say something like that?
She's suffering as well.
That's right. She's suffering too in all of the ways, not just with the children, but the property that was hers. They shared the property, the wealth, the servants. Her whole life is turned upside down and changed as well. And so she's suffering as well. And she's coming at this from her angle. And there's some frustration. So is she a villain or is she a victim? Job's wife.
Victim also.
Victim.
Yeah, a victim of suffering. And what we make of her words should be she's suffering. This isn't encouraging to Job, but I wouldn't just cancel her and say, oh, she's not a person of faith. At the end of the book, it's interesting. Job's wife is not mentioned again by name, but they do have more children, so they stay married with all of this. She doesn't say anything else. And notice Job's response to his wife. We often don't talk enough about that, but Job's response is, you speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? And all this Job did not sin with his lips. And all this Job didn't sin with his lips. That goes back to chapter 1 and verse 22. So Job kind of tries to help his wife see right. He tries to help her see properly. Hey, God's given us good. We've got to take the good and we've got to take the bad. Some people just want the good poured into their lives. They only want the blessings from God. But Job's trying to help his wife to see sometimes the ball doesn't bounce your way. Sometimes life doesn't go the way you want it to go, and you still have to serve God. So in all of this, Job didn't sin with his Job didn't sin with his lips. All right, let's take a pause for a second so I can ask you a question. What do you think of Job so far? What do we think about Job so far?
He's a faithful man.
Mm-hmm. What else?
I think he's still God fearing.
He's still God fearing for sure. What
And
else?
he loves God. He loves God um, because he recognizes God as supreme and in control.
God's
Brother,
supreme.
you mentioned something before when you mentioned the response, the first response of Job, and people sometimes pass through this. I don't remember. It was 5 steps of when someone dies, you pass through steps of
Of grief. Yeah, people talk
grieving.
about the
Yeah,
grief, five
yeah,
steps of grief. Yeah.
yeah. So the negation or doesn't want to understand what is happening. So I'm not saying that Job is not upright and everything because God said it, but probably he doesn't realize what is coming, and he thinks that this is this is happening. I don't know if this will stay for long, but he's keeping.
He's processing.
Yeah, he's trying to understand, and he knows the first idea that comes to the mind of the people because he's faithful in his this moment, and everything is happening so fast, so he's trying to understand, but now he has in his mind the fresh idea of God. But later is like all the people, if the suffering is for a long period, people start thinking differently.
That's right. You know, sometimes you bump your leg or something on a table in your house or something like, oh, that hurt. And you shake it off. And then weeks later, it's sore. Like you hit harder than you realize. Like, whoa, I didn't know I hit it that hard. That actually hurt me more. And it's a bruise later or something like that. And I think that's what happens with Job here. Job, he's hit initially, but then later on, it really starts to sink in. And then Job kind of starts thinking back and he's wondering, what did I do to deserve this? And then Job starts asking his questions and his frustrations start being fueled. And Job is working through all of that difficulty. So, yes, one thing that stands out to me from this beginning part of Job's life is Job suffered a lot. And I think we might just kind of read past this really quickly and think, okay, Job suffered. Now let's get into the heart of the discussions with the friends. But Job suffered terribly back to back, from losing his property to losing his children to servants dying. Job's trying to balance all of these things. And then his own flesh begins to fail physically. And Job is just simply going through a lot at this time, and it happens to him back to back. What we have is the benefit of knowing the conversation between God and Satan, but Job didn't have that. And so it made a big difference in how Job processed and took things in. Now let's read Job 2:11 through 13 and see what happens when Job's friends show up. It says, now when Job's three friends heard of all this evil that had come upon him, they came each from his own place. Eliphaz the Temanite, and Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They made an appointment together to come to show him sympathy and to comfort him. And when they saw him from a distance, they didn't recognize him. They raised their voices and wept, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven. And they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. So Job's friends show up, and what do you know about Job's friends?
I think they are good friends
You think he had good friends, Chris? Why do you think Job had good friends?
because I'm just imagining if someone is on his sick bed, it's likely that when you go and visit him, you go back. But for them to stay with him for 7 days and 7 nights and be with him, I think it's a very good feature of a good friend.
Yes, the first thing we see is that Job's friends came, In Matthew 9:36, we read about Jesus seeing the suffering of the people, and it says he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Well, the first thing is you mentioned these three guys, and they're from all different places. And it says in verse 11, they all heard of this evil that had come upon him. They each from his own place, from Teman and from Shua and from Nama, they all come and they make an appointment to come together to show him sympathy. So the first thing is they come out of their way to come alongside him. Sometimes when people see suffering, they pull away. But Romans 12:15 says a part of the Christian responsibility is to weep with those that weep. We bear other people's burdens. Galatians 6 and verses 1 through 5, right? Bear one another's burdens and fulfill the law of Christ. And a part of being a good friend is to come alongside people that are suffering and to help them. But here's the second thing: they gave their tears. It says that when they saw Job in verse 12, they saw him from a distance. They didn't recognize him. They raised their voices and wept, and they tore their clothes and sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven. Gracia, why were they crying? It wasn't their children or their property. Why were they crying when they saw Job?
Because they identify with his pain and they are grieving with him, so they couldn't hide their emotions because they loved Job, and they are suffering because they saw how was Job suffering with his skin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as they see his suffering, it bothers them. I can imagine as they come up on Job and his body's covered in the boils and all of the sores, and maybe they knew the 10 children and they show up and the house is quiet. No children, nobody making any noise. They're used to seeing all of his property as they walk up, nothing. Maybe Job hadn't even cleaned it all up. You got dead animals all out on the property, and they show up and they just see this complete destruction and complete turmoil that's swept through, and they give their tears. Sergio mentioned earlier that Jesus wept at the grave of Lazarus, right? He cried when he got to his friend Lazarus's tomb. He saw all of the people, he saw all of the commotion, and he empathized with the people. He saw what they were experiencing, and it ultimately it made an impact. It made a difference on him. And the reality is, when we see people suffering, it should make a difference on us. Here's the third thing that Job's friends give, though, that is helpful. They gave their presence, they showed up, they gave their tears, and they gave their silence. In verse 13, this is good for them. They sat with him on the ground for 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was great. Sergio, why do you think Job's friends didn't say anything at first when they saw Job suffering?
Yeah, I was thinking in the idea to custom to or tradition people to, for example, to tear their clothes and put the
Mm-hmm.
ashes there. So I think so. It's like a signal, maybe to signal to identify to him because
Yeah,
he suffered very deeply.
that's actually a great point, Sergio. Like, first of all, they want to look like Job. They came, they were cleaned up, they didn't have the suffering and the boils that Job had. But the first thing they do is they get down on Job's level. They tear their clothes, they put dust and ashes on their head, and they identify with Job and they get on the same level that Job is. And then, though, it says they didn't speak a word to him for 7 days and 7 nights because they saw that his suffering was very great. And sometimes when people are suffering, they just need you to
Yeah.
be there and don't say anything. Go ahead.
In Spanish, we have a very popular phrase. So one image say more than words. You know. So
Hmm.
the image of Job is very sad. So
Yeah,
in
that's
some
right.
sometimes when somebody pass this suffer, it's most important to make a silence, because the words is yeah. This is my
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. Good job. Good point. Sometimes we say too much and people just need us to be quiet, but it's hard to be quiet because we think we know the right words to say. And Job's friends are great friends at first when they show up and they don't start doing a lot of talking. They just come alongside him and they're with him. Go to Second Timothy chapter 1. I want to show you another man who was with somebody in suffering, who's a great example. Second Timothy chapter 1 and verse 16. I'm going to read this. Second Timothy 1:16. It says, this is Paul writing to Timothy. In Second Timothy 1:16, he says, may the Lord grant mercy to the house of Onesiphorus, for he often refreshed me and was not ashamed of my chains. But when he arrived in Rome, he searched for me earnestly and found me. May the Lord grant him to find mercy from the Lord on that day. And you know all the service he rendered at Ephesus. And so Paul was in prison, and Onesiphorus found Paul and went and ministered to him and came alongside Paul in a Roman prison cell and identified with his suffering and saw to his needs. And Paul's holding him up as an example to say, Timothy, this is what a faithful and courageous servant looks like. This is what it means to come alongside somebody else and to help. And so that's what Job's friends do for a whole week. Have you ever been quiet for a whole week? Whole week they didn't say anything to Job. They just all sat there because his suffering was great, and they were doing a great job until they started talking. Before 7 days nobody said anything. They just needed to be with their friend, and they came and they were alongside him. So it's a great example of how to come alongside other people and be a good friend and help people in their suffering and their hardship. Now later in chapter 12 and in chapter 16, Job will say some things about them and the kind of friends that they were. He would call them miserable comforters and terrible physicians and people that think they know everything. But when they showed up initially, their first step was right. And that was, our friend Job is suffering and we want to come alongside him and we want to help. All right, let's look at Job chapter 3. Let's look at Job chapter 3, and I'm going to read this whole chapter, and then we'll have a little bit of discussion about Job and what he says as far as his own life. And now, as he starts to speak, how things are going to change. Okay, so I'm in Job 3. Let's read these 26 verses together. After this, Job opened his mouth. He cursed the day of his birth, and Job said, let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said, a man is conceived. Let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, nor light shine upon it. Let there be let gloom and darkness claim it. Let clouds swell upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it. That night, let thick darkness seize it, and let it not rejoice among the days of the year. Let it not come into the number of the months. Behold, let that night be barren, and let no joyful cry enter it. Let those curse it who curse the day, who are ready to rouse up Leviathan. Let the stars of his dawn be dark, and let it hope for light, but have none, nor see the eyelids of the morning, because it did not shut the doors of my mother's womb, nor hide trouble from my eyes. Why did I not die at birth and come out from the womb and expire? Why did the knees receive me, or why the breast that I should nurse? For when I would have lain down and been quiet, I would have slept, and then I would have been at rest with kings and counselors of the earth who rebuilt ruins for themselves, or with the princes who had gold, or filled their houses with silver. Or why was I not as a hidden stillborn child, as infants who never see the light? There the wicked cease from troubling, and there the weary are at rest. There the prisoners are at ease together. They hear not the voice of the taskmaster. The small and the great are there, and the slave is free from his master. Why is light given to him who is in misery, and life to the bitter in soul, who long for death, but it doesn't come, and dig for it for more than for hidden treasure, who rejoice exceedingly and are glad when they find the grave? Why is light given to a man whose way is hidden, whom God has hedged in? For my sighing comes instead of my bread, and my groanings are poured out like water. For the thing that I fear comes upon me, and what I dread befalls me. I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, but trouble comes. What's changed with Job now in Job chapter 3, Christopher? What's different now?
I think, I think, I think now he's trying to blame the life that he has. That because maybe he's living, and that's the reason why maybe all this problem, like, it's even possible to come into his life. So I think now he's trying to assess what is going on. He's
Yes, there's
trying to do.
definitely some assessing going on. And as Job is assessing, how is Job handling it, David? What's some of his conclusions about his life now?
That I believe he's thinking there's this life is pointless. I should never be here, and
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, and it's because he already perhaps forget all the blessings and everything. And after 7 days in silence, he had much time to think about it with his friends. So now he thinks, no, it's I don't want to be here.
Yeah, now it's settling in with Job. Job doesn't just think this life is pointless. Sometimes that's some of what you see in Ecclesiastes. But here specifically, Job thinks his life is pointless.
Is it
Job
that he's
wishes,
thinking
And
that life is worth living? Is it
yeah,
something like that?
yeah, that's right. Gracie, what were you going to say?
yeah, so he describes like himself as someone searching for death. So he doesn't want alive. He he wants to be dead because the pain it was a lot.
Yeah, Job is hurting so bad. Job wishes he just wasn't even alive. Look at verse number 2. Job said, "Let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said a man is conceived. Let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, nor shine light upon it." And so Job is really hating that he even came into existence, because Job is so frustrated and disappointed now that the suffering's collapsed on Job. Now that Job is assessing what's happened, he's frustrated terribly. Is there anybody else in the Bible that you can think of that was so frustrated at a point that they wanted to just stop existing, that they hated their life too? Anybody you can think of that, yeah, that you can think of that didn't want to go on anymore, that didn't want to live? Anybody like that?
I was thinking once when David was uh, hunted by Saul, and many times he said, "Why a step is between me and that?" He said,
Mm-hmm.
and but sometimes he feel distressed and abandoned. But I don't think he ever said that, but he was very close.
Yeah. So sometimes David was frustrated and he thought death was right around the corner. But I'm talking about people specifically who wish that they died because of how hard
Mm,
their life was.
I think
Moses,
something.
Yeah,
Moses,
Moses for sure. Moses for
and
sure.
Numbers
Oh,
11.
Elijah.
Elijah, we're going to count them all up. Let's do them all then. Numbers 11. This is the first one in verse 14. Moses is frustrated because of the people, and he says, "I'm not able to carry all this people alone. The burden is too heavy for me." He tells God in Numbers 11:15, "If you will treat me like this, then kill me at once, if I find favor in your sight, that I may not see my wretchedness." Moses would rather die than deal with the children of Israel. And if you've read about the children of Israel, you probably know why, right? 2 million people always crying and complaining about food and water. And it just frustrates Moses to the point that Moses says, "I just would rather die." But it's not just Moses. Go to 1 Kings 19. In
Um,
first
and, and also Jonah in chapter 4, he said to God, "Just kill me now, Lord. I'd rather be dead than alive if what I predict will not happen."
That's exactly right. Yes. So if you
Yes.
read 1 Kings 19, Elijah is willing to lose his life, and he says, "You can just take my life away. There's nothing, they seek my life to take it away." And Elijah says, "I've been zealous for the Lord God. Only I am left, and they seek my life to take it away." Elijah is ready to just completely give up. If you read 1 Kings 19, it's in verse 4. He went himself a day's journey into the wilderness, came and sat down under a broom tree, and asked that he might die, saying, "It's enough now, O Lord. Take away my life, for I'm no better than my fathers." That's Elijah. So you got Moses, you got Elijah. Gracia mentioned Jonah. If you go to Jonah chapter 4, if you go to
What was the
Jonah,
verse for Moses? Sorry, the
Numbers
verse for
11,
Moses.
Numbers 11 and verse 15.
I
Numbers
think
11, 15.
I think
Mm-hmm.
some I think Samson at some point in time also wanted to be dead with his enemies.
Yeah, he wanted to die with his enemy. His is a little different. It's not a death wish per se, but he does say let him die with his enemies, and he does. But these people actually ask for God to take their life. So, like Jonah 4 and verse 3, Jonah says, "Therefore, now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it's better for me to die than to live." And the Lord said, "Do you do well to be angry?" And they have that dialogue back and forth. And I would put one more person in there, and that would be Jeremiah, right? Jeremiah has occasions like Jeremiah chapter 20, where Jeremiah says that he didn't want to speak in God's name anymore. And He also has another occasion where Jeremiah says he wants to die. So, what do all of these people, like Elijah and Jonah and all of these people, what do they teach us about faithful people in these kinds of requests? What do we learn? What do we learn from all of these requests? Yeah, Jeremiah 20:14 through 18. Jeremiah says, look at Jeremiah 20:14 through 18. It's a lot like Job. Cursed be the day on which I was born, the day my mother bore me. Let it not be blessed. Cursed be the man who brought the news to my father. A son is born to you, making him very glad. Let the man be like the cities that the Lord overthrew without pity. Let him hear a cry in the morning and an alarm at noon, because he didn't kill me in the womb. So my mother would have been my grave, and her womb forever great. Why did I come out from the womb? To see toil and sorrow and spend my days in shame. So, what do we learn from all of these different occasions?
We learn even the most faithful servants of God face the moment they want to die.
That's
If,
right.
but in each case, God met them with their lowest place and renew their purpose. And now we can see, and we read in the Bible, these are very faithful men, and they did God willing. And I want to say also Jesus, in Matthew 26, we can read verse 38. And Jesus also say, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death.
Yeah, that's right. I forgot one person in the list, and that's Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 8. Paul says, we don't want you to be unaware, brothers, of the affliction we experienced in Asia, for we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. So even Paul in 2 Corinthians 1 and verse 8 says that he and Silas and Timothy, they were so frustrated they wanted to give up on life. They were so pressed beyond their ability that they thought about quitting. Gracie is right. All of these faithful men of God went through difficulty, they went through hardship, they went through times of doubt and discouragement, but God brought them through. David, go ahead.
I was looking all these cases is because what other people is doing,
That's right. That's right.
and
Uh,
and it's hard. How hard is the life of a faithful man that is trying to proclaim, and people don't listen, or people is doing other things. It's very hard.
yeah. And these folks are all tired, right? They're tired and they're suffering, and they're thinking it'd be better to do what? Better to just die, right?
To be
Here's
with the
something.
Lord.
To be with the Lord, to be far better. Philippians 1:23. Here's something to keep in mind about all of these cases, especially in the modern world that's different from them in the ancient world, that I think is important. All of them were suffering, right? All of them were hating their circumstances, right? But none of them committed suicide and took their life into their own hands. Every one of these men, they were frustrated. They didn't like what they were having to go through, but they still believed life was worth living. They're speaking poetically and saying, I wish I was never born. But now that they are born, none of these men, they all could have taken their life. People in the Bible commit suicide, but never did these men say, my life's so bad, it's so dark, it's so terrible, I give up altogether. And every one of them that held on, and this is what we should say to people that are going through terribly dark times: you cannot take matters into your own hands. You must hold on and see it through to the other side. Some people get so darkened down, they don't think there's another way. But one of the positives in all of these occasions, Job said a lot of crazy things. Job didn't want to live, but Job never stopped and felt like he had the right and the authority. These people with their Hebrew heritage and background, knowing God, they did not think, well, I've got the right, I can take my life into my own hands. They believe that God gives life and God has the ability to take life. And a lot of people in our modern world, it doesn't matter what country you live in, they get down, they get frustrated, and they think we can create our own exit. If we want to leave, we just go. And these men, Jeremiah and Jonah and Moses and Elijah and Paul and Job, they stuck with it. And so it's just a lesson for us, and hopefully something to teach other people. All right. It's 2 o'clock my time, maybe 3 o'clock Eastern time. Let's take a break, 15-20 minute break, and we'll be back and pick up for the rest of the class. Okay. Let's take a break. And if you got any questions about Job or suicide or anything I said about chapter 3, we can pick up with that when we come back.
Thank you.
All right. How's everybody doing? Y'all ready? All right. So what we'll do is I'm going to teach until 3 o'clock my time, which is probably 4 y'all's time. Okay. We'll go 40 more minutes and I'll let y'all out at right at the hour. Okay. Does that make sense? Only person I can see is Gracia, but I guess everybody else is tracking with that. Okay. So let's pick up back up in Job chapter 3 and pick up where we left off with Job's lament over his circumstances. Okay. I don't know if David's back. Let me wait a second and see when David and Chris come back. Let me just give them a second to come back on. All right, everybody's back. Great. All right. I just was saying I'm going to teach for the 40 more minutes to the hour. My time is 3 o'clock. Eastern time is 4 o'clock. So it may be four for y'all, but I'll stop there and then give y'all the rest off the 30 minutes. But I do want to explain when we get to 3 o'clock what you'll do for Thursday. I mean, for Tuesday, because Tuesday I'm going to be out of town preaching on the lectureship at Faulkner University. Dave will be there too. So we won't have class, but I'll give you something to do for Tuesday, or you'll have an assignment to do as far as some reading and some studying in the book of Job. But that's going to depend on how far we get in the next 40 minutes up until the hour. Okay. So wherever we leave off, I'll have you read a section and outline it and basically just give me some information from that section. Okay. But let's talk a little bit more about Job chapter 3, and then we will go from there. All right. All right, let's rock and roll. Chapter 3. Let's start talking about what Job says. So basically, oh, here's one more thing to keep in mind about Job. I would put Jonah, well, I would put Job in this category, and I would put Jeremiah 20 in this category. I talked about Jeremiah wishing for death and Jeremiah 20:14 through 18. Here's another thing to keep in mind. We talked about this the first day of class when we talked about the genre of the book of Job. What kind of writing is Job? What kind of writing is the book of Job?
Poetry.
Oh, my volume's down. That's my bad. Yeah, poetry. You said poetry? Yeah, so
Yes.
it's poetry. So that also means don't press the statements. I mean, the statements are true. Poetry in the Bible is true biblical poetry, but poetry in the Bible is to be taken poetically and not lyrically. So the things Job is saying about his life and all of that, don't press into those details overly so, as much as we would say, I love you to the moon and back, or something like that, where you're not going to the moon. You just mean, I love you very much, right? Or it's raining cats and dogs in America. People say that. And that just means it's raining really hard. Nobody's looking for pedos and catos falling out of the sky, right? Like that isn't happening. So you just know figures of speech. The same thing's true in Job chapter 3. But here's what he says: let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that was conceived, a night that said a man conceived, let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, nor shine light upon it. So in the ancient world, there was kind of seen to be this advantage to being born as a man, a male, because you could go out and work and provide a living. And when a man knew that he had given birth to male offspring, there was this excitement. And Job is saying, I wish that day of excitement never came. In verse 5, let gloom and deep darkness be upon it. Let the clouds dwell upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it. That night, let thick darkness seize it. Let it not rejoice among the days of the year. Let it not come into the number of months. Behold, let that night be barren. Let no joyful cry enter it. Let those who curse it curse the day who are ready to rouse up Leviathan. So here Job is saying, my birth date, the date that Job was born, January 1st, whenever that was BC, right? Whenever Job was born, Job is saying that should be a day that people pronounce cursing on and disappointment and frustration. Nothing good came from that. Job's angry about the way that his life has turned out, and he's saying he wishes that that day never took place. Look at verse 9. Let the stars of its dawn be dark. Let it hope for light, but have none, nor see the eyelids. All of this that Job is saying, he's talking about a day, okay? He's talking about that actual day. He wishes, like if Job was born January 1st, he wishes that the calendar just skipped and January 2nd was there, that there was never even that day on the calendar. He's that down and depressed. That way, if Job never existed, he wouldn't be what? If Job never existed, if Job was never born, then what wouldn't be happening to him right now? He wouldn't be what?
Suffering.
He wouldn't be suffering. In your life and in the life of other people, sometimes suffering makes us wish we could get out of it. And one of the sure ways to get out of it is two ways. If you never existed, or if you can just go to eternity with God. But God doesn't always provide those easy escape routes. This is now Job is angry, and I'll talk about angry Job's speech in a minute. But Job is angry, and sometimes the way we view suffering is, I really would like a life where there was no suffering, right? Right? Like we just want a life with joy. Let me ask you a question. Remember, I told you there are three worlds. Which world is going to be the one with no suffering and everything working out for you? Put it up. Let me see it. And if you start wanting this while you're here, you're going to be mad at God a lot of times and be frustrated. A lot of people in the world are mad with God. They don't believe in God because of evil, pain, and suffering and all of that, because they think they're in world number 3, but they're really where? What world are we in?
The second one.
And if you remember which world you're in every day of your life, when good things happen here, you'll say, I kind of expected that. That happens in world number 2. God sends good things down, but bad things happen. Job wants out. And the way Job would like to be out is if Job just was never here. And sometimes life comes tumbling in and you wish, I just wish this never happened. Or you ever have a situation with somebody, a relationship, a friend, a boyfriend, a girlfriend, a husband, a wife, and it gets so bad and you think, man, I wish I never met this person. If I would have never went to that school, if I would have never met them, if I would have never sent that text, if I never engaged with this person, then I wouldn't be in this circumstance now. But here's the reality in world number 2. You can't undo anything that's happened. So Job can wish all he wants, but Job is here. Once you're here, that's it. You can't go backwards and undo anything as far as relationships or people you met or deeds that you've done or even your own existence. By the way, even when people get so down and frustrated that they commit suicide, they haven't stopped existing. You stop existing here, but you can't undo all the bad stuff that happened to you. There is no escape route. So you've got to go with God through your difficulties and let him refine you and let him sharpen you and strengthen you through it. But this escape route that says, well, I wish this never happened, it's too late for that. That's for the movies. In the movies, they can skip days and make things that never happen. But in real life, once something's happened on the calendar, there's no going back to pretend that it didn't. And that's how frustrated Job is. He wishes these events never took place. I'm in verse number 9. It says, let the stars of it be dark. Let it hope for light, but have none, nor see the eyelids of the morning, because it didn't shut the doors of my mother's womb, nor hide its eye from trouble. Why did I not die at birth and come out from the womb and expire? Why did the knees receive me, or why the breast that I should nurse? For when I would have lain down and be quiet, I would have slept, and then I would have been at rest with kings and counselors of the earth who rebuilt ruins for themselves, or with the princes who had gold, who filled their houses with silver. Or why was I not hidden? Why was I not as a hidden child stillborn, as infants who never see the light? There the wicked cease from troubling. Verse 17 is so important. It's one of the more famous verses in the book of Job. Job says, there in the land of the dead, look at what he says in verse 17. There in Sheol, in the Old Testament realm of the dead, where the departed spirits go, there the wicked cease from troubling, and there the weary are at rest. There the prisoners are at ease together. They hear not the voice of the taskmaster. The small and the great are there, and the slave is free from his master. So what is Job saying? When you die, you get to go away from what?
The trouble,
You
Um,
get away from all your troubles. There, the wicked cease from troubling, and the weary be at rest. If you could just get out of here, you don't have to deal with anything anymore. Job wants out of his problems. This is important, guys. This is important because Job doesn't hate life. Job doesn't hate living. Job hates pain. That's the thing. People commit suicide. People give up on life. They don't hate life. They don't hate existing. They don't hate when good things happen to them. We don't like pain, right? But everybody in the world needs a worldview that's going to help you when pain comes because you can't get away from it. Becoming an atheist isn't going to help you escape pain. Becoming a Christian isn't going to help you escape pain. Ending your life isn't going to help you escape pain necessarily. You've got to get some kind of spiritual material, scripture, your relationship with God, your faith in Jesus Christ that can make your suffering redemptive, meaning it can make your suffering mean something and have value, but you're not getting away from suffering. And that's what Job wants. Job doesn't hate his life or hate his existence. Job hates the chapters in his life that involve suffering, especially the hard and difficult chapter that we read about in chapter 1 with the 10 funerals and all the property and all the servants. And that's why Job's lashing out. It's because Job doesn't like the suffering that he's facing. In verse 20, he says, why is light given to him who is in misery, and life to the bitter in soul, who long for death, but it doesn't come, and dig for it more than for hidden treasures? This is somebody on a journey to get out of this life. They're digging for it more than they dig and search for hidden treasures. That's a phrase that's found in the book of Proverbs for wisdom. In Proverbs 2, 1-4, Solomon says, if you search for it as wisdom and as for hidden treasures. Well, here Job's using that phrase, and he's talking about it from the standpoint of searching for what? What is Job searching for in verses 20 and 21?
Answer?
What is Job looking for in Job 3, 20 and 21? What is he searching for, like hidden treasure?
he was looking at that God gives light to those who only suffer.
That's right. But then he says they can't even find what in verse 21? What are they looking for?
Death.
Death. He wants to find death. Job wants his exit. Job wants to get out. He's looking for his emergency exit. And he's saying, I'm searching for death like a hidden treasure, and I can't find it. In verse 23, he says, or verse 22, they rejoice exceedingly and are glad when they find the grave. Why is light given to a man whose way is hidden, who God has hedged in? There he goes. Now he's mentioning God for the first time, about God blocking his way. So he's suffering, and God puts him in this block called life, and God won't let Job out. And he says, just let me out so I can go my own way. And God has him hedged in, and he's making him face it. In verse 24, my sighing comes instead of my bread, and my groanings are poured out like water. For the thing that I fear comes upon me, and what I dread befalls me. I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, but trouble comes. Who is Job talking to? Right now, this is the first speech from Job. Later, there's going to be these dialogues. And if you look at the syllabus, I have the dialogues broken up between the people that Job's talking to and Job. So you've got Job chapter 4-7 with Eliphaz, and then Bildad, and then there's stuff with Zophar. But in Job chapter 3, who is Job talking to?
To God.
To God? Who else maybe?
To himself.
Maybe just out in the
friends.
air, Gracia, to himself, and maybe to the friends. But I like maybe Job's just talking. You ever get mad and you're just driving or you're just walking, you're just talking to yourself. You just have an inner dialogue with yourself. Job's just talking in chapter 3, probably directing it toward God, but also just out in the open. What should Job's friends have done when they heard Job saying these kinds of things out into the open? Because it says in chapter 3 and verse 1, then Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. Did Job ask for any help yet? Did Job ask anybody to help make sense of his suffering and why this is happening to him? What do we call this that Job is doing? What's the word for this? People say it all the time today when they're going through something and they just want to talk to somebody about it, but they don't really want your advice or anything. What is this called? Sergio, I think you know. What's this called?
A crazy person, maybe.
Maybe a crazy person. Anybody
Intrusive?
ever? Well, sometimes people say I'm just venting. Y'all hear that before?
Oh
A
yeah.
person, they don't really want your response. They had a bad day at work. They don't want you to come up to the job and solve it. They don't want you to beat anybody up or shoot anybody, right? They just are talking out into the air and they're just venting. And I think that's what Job's doing. And again, this is in line with the biblical genre of lament. It's just Job just expressing his emotions. And even though Job says some very disturbing things in chapter 3, I think it's healthy for Job to get this out. Job didn't post it on social media. I don't think that's a good idea. People post all of their feelings and they're mad at the church and they do. I think that's a foolish thing to do. Job is either talking to God, which he probably is doing some of that too, but he's also just dealing with it himself and finally just screaming out about all he's raging at the heavens because he's mad about what he's lost and he's trying to process it. So he hasn't asked anybody anything. He's just struggling through. What should his friends have done, Christopher, when they heard Job saying these kinds of things?
At
I think
least
you
about
froze.
what kind of life.
What was that? Your screen was frozen. I couldn't hear you. Okay, go ahead now. What did you say?
Can you can you hear me now? I think they should have tried to encourage him about at least the good thing that has happened in his life
Maybe
before.
they could have encouraged Job about the good things. What else could Job's friends do when he said this kind of stuff, Sergio? What could Job's friends have done? What should they maybe have done? If we went to somebody's house and they suffered like Job's suffering, and we show up and they start saying the kinds of things that Job is saying in chapter 3, what should we do? Everybody in this class, what would you do?
I think you listen,
I wouldn't
but
say anything. Just listen. That's
listen.
right.
Yeah,
Don't say anything. I think that's the
yeah.
right answer.
And the second step maybe uh, some intervention, but if the person permit to talking, maybe pray for him or
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I don't think you can go wrong with praying, but I think just listen, don't say anything because you never had 10 funerals in one day. That's a lot. You don't have the boils on your skin. That's a lot. And so just listening. Yes, Job is saying some heavy things, but Job is hurting deeply and Job doesn't know why. I think that's what's eating at Job the most. Job doesn't have a clue why all of this back to back, all of this has happened to him. Yes, David, go ahead.
I was thinking, I think it's something that us humans always we want to talk, and sometimes I believe that the friends for a moment they forgot the reason why they were there, and they forgot the suffering of Job, and they focus on what he said.
Yes, yes, yes. And it became about who was right and who was the smartest. And they're having this big theological debate and they're throwing out these phrases about God back and forth. But like you mentioned, David, and you make a great point, they forgot why they came. Because in Job chapter 2, it says they came to Job because they saw that his suffering was great. But then they start attacking what he says in his speech and they forgot why they came. And that was a mistake on their hand. Okay, now let's talk about.
Hello, brother.
Yes, go ahead, Christopher.
I'm not feeling quite well.
Okay,
I'm treating. So when I sit for long, I feel pain in my epigastric area, so I have to lie down a
okay.
bit. So I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. That's fine. No problem. You do what you got to do. I hope you get some relief for sure. You do what you got to do to be comfortable. Um, so let's talk about Job's angry speech. Angry speech in the book of Job. One of the things in Job to keep in mind is Job's going to go back and forth. Sometimes you're going to read statements from Job, and Job will say, I know my witness and my record is in heaven, Job 16:19. Or Job will say, I know my Redeemer lives, and he'll stand on the earth in the last days. And in my flesh I'll see God, Job 19:24 and 25. Sometimes Job will say, after God has tried me, I'm going to come out like gold, Job 23 and verse 10. Or he'll say, my record's in heaven, or though he slay me, yet will I trust in him, Job 13 and verse 15. He'll have these statements of faith and confidence in God. But then other times Job will say things like this in chapter 3. Listen, the stuff Job says in chapter 3 about his birth, these are tough things, but this is not the worst. Job has more to say coming up, especially chapter 9 and especially chapter 21. It's Job's going to say some very striking things about how he thinks God views him and how God runs the world. Even in chapter 16, though there's some statements of faith there, he thinks that God's not doing things the best. How do we handle the angry speech of Job? Well, we just remember, even in the angry speeches, one, Job is a good man, upright, blameless, fears God, and turns away from evil. Job 1:1, Job 1 and verse 8. Secondly, we remember that Job is suffering terribly and he doesn't know why. And number 3, here's another thing. And David, you mentioned this about the friends, but it's also true about Job. As the arguments begin to happen with the friends and with Job, Job forgets kind of what's happening too, and it all becomes about winning the argument with the friends. All of them start trying to fight about who's right about Job's circumstances and who's right about how God runs the universe and runs the world. Remember, I told you the book of Job is largely about how God runs his universe. And everybody has different ideas in the book of Job on what they think that's about and how that ought to be done. And as Job starts some of this angry speech and he says some of these things, you can't use those statements to disqualify his righteousness and holiness. And here's a practical thing. When other people you know are suffering, don't take their statements that they make in anger to be what they really think about God or about faith or about heaven or about Jesus, because angry people say foolish things. Does Job still have faith in Job chapter 3? Yes. How do you know? I can't hear you, David. I don't know why.
Oh, sorry, the other thing. So he didn't charge anything to God yet.
Not
He
yet, Dad. Not yet.
no
Not yet.
yet,
It's coming. He's one.
but yeah.
Yeah. What else? Somebody else was going to say something.
Probably I saw in Job a hidden faithful, but the faith
Mm-hmm.
is here.
Yeah.
He believe in God. He know the responsibility, but it's hidden.
Yes. So faith that grieves is still faith. Just because a faith is grieving doesn't mean a faith has disappeared. Yes. Go ahead, Grayson.
Yeah, because even when we can see in chapter 3, Job's hope was silenced, his faith was alive because he kept turning toward God, not away from him.
Yes.
He was still speaking with God and try, and he still say God is a creator, and of course he still believe in God.
Yes, and you can see a picture of that in verse 23. Why is light given to a man whose way is hidden, who God is hedged in? Job still thinks God's in control. One of the interesting things about the book of Job is this. This is something to think about. Job suffered a lot, right? The book of Job is long. It's 42 chapters. What does that tell you? Job stuck with God through it all. Like the book of Job could have just ended at chapter 3. Job says, I'm done talking about this. I quit. But there's 42 chapters of Job trying to wrestle through and make sense of why he's suffering the way that he is and answering the friends and going back and forth. Job hasn't quit. Job's actually trying to dig in and get to his answers. And when a person's suffering, some people, they don't get mad. They just give up. Some people in suffering don't get mad, they give up. But Job gets mad, but he also tries to get to the bottom of it. Now, the way he tries to do it isn't the best. He makes some mistakes, but he still holds fast. Now, we may have time to do one of the speeches from the friends. The first person to speak is Eliphaz. Now, here's what we can say, and we'll see this later. Eliphaz is going to say this later on, I think in chapter 15. He'll say, he'll tell Job, the wisdom of the gray hairs with us, we're older than your fathers. These are Job's friends. It seems like Eliphaz is the leader. He's always mentioned first, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, he's mentioned first in verse 11 of chapter 2. And when God shows up in chapter 42 and verse 7, he's going to speak directly to Eliphaz. He'll say, Eliphaz, you and your friends haven't spoken what's right concerning me as my servant Job has. Eliphaz may be the oldest. All of these men come from places. When you check out the geographical place where they're from, these places were known for their wisdom, especially the place of Teman. The prophets will talk about the wisdom of Teman. And so they were known for some of their wisdom. And so they think they know some things. And some of the things these men say are accurate and they're right. They just don't apply to Job. And that's a big mistake. So let's start with Eliphaz's speech first. I'm going to read all of chapter 4. Oh, one more thing about the friends. The longer the speeches go, the worse they get. So first they say, Job, cheer up, it'll get better. Then they say, tell us what you did. Then they say, we know what you did. You're a rotten sinner. You need to repent. I mean, it just gets worse and worse for Job. But this is how it starts with Eliphaz, chapter 4. He says this. Then Eliphaz the Temanite answered and said, if one ventures a word with you, will you be impatient? Yeah, who can keep from speaking? Okay, David, that's the first thing. In verse 2, he says that last part, if one ventures a word with you, will you be impatient? He's basically saying to Job, if somebody says something to you, Job, are you going to listen? And then what's the last part of verse 2, David?
It says, but who can withhold himself from speaking?
I've got to say something. No, you don't,
Mhm.
Eliphaz. You don't have to say something, but he thinks he does. He says, who can see all of this and hear all of this and keep from speaking? Well, he could have, but he didn't. Here we go in verse 3. Behold, you have instructed many, and you have strengthened the weak hands. Your words have upheld him who was stumbling, and you have made firm the feeble knees. But now it has come to you, and you are impatient. It touches you, and you are dismayed. Is not your fear of God, your confidence, and the integrity of your ways, your hope? Remember, who that was innocent ever perished, or where were the upright cut off? As I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. By the breath of God they perish, and by the blast of his anger they are consumed. The roar of the lion, the voice of the fierce lion, the teeth of the young lions are broken. The strong lion perishes for lack of prey, and the cubs of the lioness are scattered. Now a word was brought to me stealthily, and my ear received the whisper of it. Amid thoughts from visions of the night, when deep sleep falls on men, dread came upon me and trembling, which made all my bones shake. A spirit glided past my face. The hair of my flesh stood up. It stood still, but I could not discern its appearance. A form was before my eyes, and there was silence, and then I heard a voice. Can mortal man be in the right before God? Can a man be pure before his maker? Even in his servants, he puts no trust. In his angels, he charges with error. How much more those who dwell in houses of clay, whose foundations is in the dust, and who are crushed like the moth. Between morning and evening, they are beaten to pieces. They perish forever without anyone regarding it. Okay, so here's where we start with Mr. Eliphaz here. He says, I've got to say something. And the first thing he says, look at verses 3 through 6. He says, behold, you have instructed many. You strengthened the weak hands. Your words have upheld him who was stumbling. You've made him firm, but now it's come to you and you're impatient. So what is he saying to Job in verses 3 through 5? Job has helped a lot of people, but now what?
I think he's trying to say that now that he is down, he's maybe talking a lot and questioning a whole lot of things.
That's exactly right. He's saying you are somebody who has given a lot of other people instruction, Job, but now that it's your turn, you can't take it. I don't know where Eliphaz is getting that from, but his mindset is, Job, when other people were suffering, you had a lot of things to say. And now that it's your turn, you can't take it. Look at verse 5. But now that it's come to you, you are impatient. It touches you and you're dismayed. Is not your fear of God your confidence, and the integrity of your ways your hope? He's saying, you're this great man of faith, Job. You believe in God and all of this. And now that it's come to you, you can't handle it. Well, that's every one of us somewhat. You can see other people go through things and you think, why don't they just pray and have faith and trust God? But when it comes to us, it's different. It hurts directly when it's you. It's not as easy to just say, hey, go pray and just go do this. There are no easy, pat answers for human suffering like this. And so Eliphaz comes in and he's attacking Job and accusing him of, well, it's always Job when it's other people, you could handle it, but now you can't. And then he says this in verse 7. This is the retribution principle that they start trying to apply to Job. It starts in verse 7. This is key because this is how Job's friends reason throughout the book. This is how they think. What does Eliphaz say, Gracia, in verse 7?
Remember who that was innocent ever perished, or where were the upright cut off?
What does that mean? Who that was innocent ever perished, and where are the upright cut off? What is Eliphaz saying?
Mm, like he believes that good people are always blessed and bad people always suffer.
Hey, who was innocent that ever perished? If you perished, you must have did something what?
But
And he says, where were the upright ever cut off? Nothing happens to upright people. So Job is suffering. So Job must be what kind of person?
bad person.
That's what Eliphaz is thinking. Is Eliphaz right, though? No, he's
No,
wrong.
no, he
Job
wasn't
is
right.
right, righteous and holy. But in his mind, he's thinking, Job, if you were a really good person, you wouldn't be suffering like this. See, he's already got his little boxes made up, and he thinks, Job, if you're suffering, this is easy. It just works out this way. Look at how you're living. So he's saying, if you were innocent, you wouldn't perish. And he describes how the wicked perish in verses 7 through 11. That's basically what Eliphaz is doing. He's describing how the wicked always meet their ruin. And he's saying, these kind of things just happen to wicked people. And then in verse 12, he talks about receiving a
Please, I
revelation
have a
from God.
question.
Go ahead.
Is it that in their time or in their era, that was what was being seen? Or
That's what was believed. I don't think that was always seen. I don't think the world's ever always been that way. Upright people get all the good, bad people get all the bad. But I think people have always tried to make sense of suffering. And here's one thing about people: we like easy answers. Christopher, think about Job's friends. If righteous people can suffer for no reason, then what does that mean about them? It could happen to them too. So they've got to make sense of this, and they really want it to make sense so they don't think it's just random suffering. What do people say when somebody dies? The first thing they say, how did they die? Because they want to make sure people don't just drop dead. Because if people can just drop dead, then that might happen to me. But if something happens to somebody, if they get sick or if they die, and if we can make sense of it and reason through it, we can count ourselves safe. One of the reasons why Job's friends say the stuff that they do is because they want to protect themselves. They don't want to believe that time and chance could happen to anybody. Ecclesiastes 9 talks about that in verse 10 and 11. Time and chance happen to them all. This could happen to anybody. No, they're thinking, no, 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 we don't want that. We've got to be able to point to something and say, this happened because you were wicked. I'm not wicked, so whew, that'll never happen to me. But that's not true. It can invade anybody's life. So I think it was the prominent view in the ancient world, but it's because one, people always wanted to make sense of suffering, which is a good thing. But people want safe answers that are tidy and neat, and they forget that world number two is a mixed bag. World number two has good and it has bad, and sometimes you suffer even though you didn't do anything wrong. That's always been true. And the book of Job, written in an ancient Near Eastern context, is trying to help people learn that lesson. So they won't keep thinking this way, even in this time period. So they won't. But guess what? When you get to the New Testament, don't people still think the same way? Go to John chapter 9 and notice what happens with Jesus and his disciples on one occasion. Jesus in John 9 is going to heal the blind man. And in John 9, look at what happens in verses 1 and 2 with Jesus and his disciples. It says, as he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus answered, it was not this man that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God should be displayed in him. So when the disciples see the blind man, the first thing they think is somebody, he or his parents, must have committed a what? A sin, because they're thinking this is how it works. Bad things happen to bad people and good things happen to good people. And when Jesus tells them, later on in Matthew chapter 19, he'll say about the rich young ruler, it's hard for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. They say, well, who can be saved then? Because in their mind, they're thinking if you're rich, you're blessed by God, everything in your life is going positively. And they think that that's a sign that you've got God's favor and God's approval, but it doesn't work that way. And Eliphaz is mistaken in his thoughts. Let me finish chapter 4 really quickly. In verse 12, Eliphaz talks about a vision he's received from God and some information he has. And look at what he says in verse 17. This is pretty interesting. Eliphaz says in Job 4:17, can a mortal be in the right before God, and can a man be pure before his maker? What is the answer to that question?
No.
You think so? Why not? Now, before you answer, David, think about Job 1 and verse 1 and Job 1 and verse 8. Can a man be upright before God, and can a man be pure before his maker?
Yes.
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 That's
It
the whole
says
book
more.
of Job. Yes, Job can be upright. See, Eliphaz is going to create this idea that God doesn't like anybody. Look at verse number 18. He says, even in his servants, he puts no trust, and his angels he charges with error. Eliphaz is saying God doesn't trust anybody. God doesn't trust his angels. God doesn't trust his servants, Job. God doesn't trust anybody because nobody can be right before him. Does God trust Job?
Yes.
Yes,
Because he
he
says
told the Satan, he said, I've got nobody like him. You can put him
he's
to the test.
blameless.
He's blameless, he's upright, I trust him. Eliphaz is saying God looks at everybody out of the side of his eye. He doesn't trust anybody, and you never know what God's up to because people are not worthy of God's trust, and nobody can be pure in God's eyes. Nobody can be sinless, but people can be acceptable before God. Even in the old covenant, they could be, and that's why Job is called a good and blameless, upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. Eliphaz is showing up and saying, Job, you're suffering because you're evil, and everybody's evil, and God doesn't trust anybody, and you never know what's going to happen because God doesn't even trust the angels. He charges his angels with error, and his servants he puts no trust in. But if you read Job chapter 1, you know that's not true. Eliphaz is wrong about that. God does put trust in his servants. God does say, hey, these are my children. They're faithful. I trust them. I think that they can do the right thing. Lastly, in verses 19 and 20, he just says, how much more those who dwell in houses of clay? So he's saying in verse 19, if he doesn't trust the angels, what about human beings who dwell in houses of clay, whose foundation is in the dust, who are crushed like a moth? Between morning and evening, they're beaten to pieces. They perish forever without anyone regarding it. So Eliphaz is saying, God doesn't trust his heavenly servants. He doesn't trust angels, and he definitely doesn't trust who? He doesn't trust human beings, and especially Job. He's saying he doesn't trust anybody. He says God doesn't put any confidence in anybody. They perish and nobody cares about it. Is that true? People die and God doesn't care about them? God doesn't trust anybody? See, that's what Eliphaz is saying to Job. He's saying, Job, you suffer. By the way, when he says they perish and nobody cares about it, who just lost 10 children?
Oh, Job.
That's
Job.
a pretty mean thing to say to somebody who's had 10 funerals. Hey, people die and nobody cares. God doesn't trust anybody, and you just never know with God. And God doesn't put confidence in angels, and he definitely doesn't care about humans. We're just big balls of dust, and one day we die and nobody cares about us. Is that true? Psalm 56 says all of our tears are accounted for. David says, aren't my tears written in your book? God cares about people suffering in hardship, and he doesn't just shrug his shoulders and say, well, it wasn't me, no big deal. But see, Eliphaz is trying to make God out to be tougher and more careless than he is, and that's not the God of the Bible. And he's going to say more in chapter 5, and then Job will respond to him in chapter 6 and chapter 7. So what I want us to do, since we won't have class on Tuesday, I want you to read Job 5, Job 6 and verse 7 and Job 7. So Job chapter 5, chapter 6, and chapter 7. When we come to class, I want you to make some notes, and I want you to tell me in each of the speeches, in 5 with Eliphaz and in 6 and 7 with Job, here are the good things they said. Here are the bad things they said and why. Here's why this doesn't make sense. So here are some of the good things Eliphaz said, if there are anything good. And here's some of the bad things they said, and here's where they misrepresent God and get things wrong. I also want you to put in any questions you have, like what does this phrase mean? Why did Job say this? Or what is this about? And just kind of work through the speeches between Eliphaz and Job in Job chapters 5, 6, and 7. And when I come back on Thursday, we won't meet Tuesday, but when I come back on Thursday, we will work through this first round of speeches, because everybody goes around with Job. Everybody goes 2 rounds with Job, okay? Job speaks, then the friends, and then that's 1 round. Then somebody else jumps in. And another thing to think about Job, it's a 3-on-1. You know, these 3 guys are attacking just this one man by himself. And so, yeah, we're going to work through some of the speeches and the dialogue and what they say about Job and how Job responds to them. So again, read chapter 5, note the good things, note the bad things or the wild things that they say, and then put questions, and do the same thing for chapter 6 for Job's response and chapter 7. And we'll talk through some of what y'all take notes on and what you see when we meet next Thursday. All right. Any questions? All right. Well, thanks for a good class. Appreciate your participation. And I look forward to seeing y'all on Thursday. Take it easy.
Thank you, brother.
Thank you, brother.
Have a safe trip.
For actually gathering.
For sure.
God bless you.